What if a legacy, forged over a century in fire and steel, was about to be shattered not by a market crash or a corporate takeover, but by a flaw so minuscule it was invisible to the naked eye? What if the only person in a room of industry titans who could see this catastrophic error was not a seasoned executive or a master artisan, but a 22-year-old waitress, haunted by the ghost of a dream she'd been forced to abandon? This is the story of Alistair Finch, the patriarch of the last great American watchmaking dynasty, on the precipice of the most important launch of his life. And Alara Rousseau, the young woman who served him his steak, who saw a hairline fracture not just in a piece of metal, but in the very foundation of his empire, and in doing so, altered the course of both their lives forever. Hold on, because the truth of what she saw and the courage it took to speak it will redefine what it means to see true value. The air inside Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse on Chicago's iconic Rush Street was a living thing. It was a thick, smoky blend of expensive bourbon, sizzling prime beef, and the quiet, confident hum of generational wealth. For Alara Rousseau, it was the smell of a gilded cage where she performed her nightly penance. At 22, her life was a carefully balanced equation of exhaustion and anxiety, a ledger filled with her mother's medical bills and the ever-present specter of student loan debt. Just 2 years prior, she had been the star pupil in the Rhode Island School of Design's jewelry and metalsmithing program. Her hands, now calloused from carrying heavy trays, were meant for finer things, for shaping silver, for setting gems, for understanding the secret language of alloys and the precise alchemy of heat and pressure. Her father, a third-generation clockmaker, had taught her that language before she could properly read. He had shown her the soul in a perfectly balanced escapement wheel, the history and the patina of old brass. Then a sudden aggressive illness had stolen his steady hands, and soon after, his life, leaving behind a mountain of debt that had forced Alara to trade her jeweler's loupe for a server's apron. Every evening, she moved through the labyrinth of mahogany tables, her smile a polite, impenetrable shield. Her uniform, a starched white shirt and black trousers, was her armor. But her shoes were the true storytellers. They were sensible black flats, purchased from a discount store, the insoles compressed into a pathetic thinness that offered no defense against the miles she walked on the unforgiving marble floors. The dull ache in her arches was a constant, throbbing reminder of the chasm between the life she was living and the one she had lost. She served men who casually ordered bottles of Screaming Eagle Cabernet that cost more than her and her mother's rent for 3 months. Tonight, the magnetic north of the restaurant was Booth 14, a deep, circular leather sanctuary permanently reserved for Alistair Finch. His name wasn't just known in Chicago, it was a part of the city's very fabric. Finch and Sons, founded in 1888, was the last bastion of true American horological craftsmanship. In a world dominated by the Swiss and the encroaching tide of smartwatches, Finch and Sons made mechanical masterpieces, timepieces that were heirlooms the moment they were boxed. Alistair Finch, at 72, was a man carved from granite and regret. He was a craftsman who had been forced by time and tide to become a CEO. His eyes, the color of a winter sky over Lake Michigan, held the fatigue of a man who had fought too many wars against cheaper, faster, and easier. He was not flamboyant like the crypto billionaires or the tech wunderkinds who sometimes drifted into his restaurant. He was old money, old industry, old standards. Tonight, his booth was a command center. To his right sat Marcus Thorne, his executive vice president of production. Thorne, a man in his late 50s with a predator's smile and a suit that seemed shrink-wrapped to his frame, had been with the company for 30 years. He was smooth, ambitious, and the architect of the company's recent, aggressive modernization. Opposite them were two grim-faced men in identical navy suits, lawyers from a powerhouse firm, their briefcases resting by their feet like loyal dogs. The tension at the table was a low-frequency vibration, a palpable pressure that made the simple act of refilling a water glass feel like diffusing a bomb. Alara's role was to be a phantom, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to exist without being seen. But her ears, trained to hear the subtle click of a misaligned gear, were impossible to shut off. As she served the bread, she caught fragments of their hushed, urgent conversation. The first production run of 10,000 units is complete. The launch campaign kicks off in 48 hours. That was Thorne, his voice a confident baritone. The private equity group has the final purchase agreement. Their due diligence is contingent on a flawless launch. Flawless, Marcus? There is no such thing. Alistair Finch's voice was a low growl, gravelly with skepticism. There is only good enough, and good enough is not in the Finch vocabulary. The name of the private equity firm, Sterling Vanguard, sent a chill through Alara. She'd read about them. They were vultures who bought heritage brands, stripped them for parts, outsourced the labor, and sold the hollowed-out husk for a profit. The idea of them getting their hands on Finch & Sons felt like a sacrilege. Spread across the center of the table, resting on a black velvet cloth like a crown jewel, was the reason for this monumental deal. It was the Finch Elysian, the most ambitious timepiece the company had ever produced. It was Alistair Finch's magnum opus, a decade in the making, a watch designed to prove to the world that American craftsmanship could still reign supreme. Its case was forged from a proprietary platinum alloy, its face a single, flawless disc of midnight blue aventurine that shimmered with 1,000 tiny stars. It was, by all accounts, perfect. The lawyers droned on about closing mechanics and SEC filings. Thorne spoke of market projections and influencer endorsements. Alistair Finch just stared at the watch, his expression a mixture of paternal pride and deep-seated anxiety. He was a king preparing to send his heir into a battle he knew would determine the fate of his kingdom. Alara moved away, her mind a whirlwind. It was just a table, just another group of rich men moving pieces on a board she couldn't even see. She had her own battles to fight, her own kingdom, a small two-bedroom apartment in Logan Square, to defend. But as she retreated toward the warmth and clatter of the kitchen, she felt an unfamiliar pang. It was the ghost of her father, whispering to her about integrity, about the soul of the maker being present in the thing that is made. She didn't know it yet, but that ghost was about to push her into the fire. The dinner service unfolded with the rigid precision of a military parade. Appetizers were served and cleared. Steaks arrived, cooked to the exact temperature specified. Wine was poured with a steady hand. The conversation at Booth 14 remained a tense murmur of billion-dollar figures, contractual obligations, and exit strategies. Thorne was the picture of confidence, laughing easily and reassuring Alistair at every turn. Alistair, however, remained coiled, a spring of tension, his eyes repeatedly drawn back to the Elysian watch sitting in the center of the table. Alara worked on autopilot, her body executing the familiar ballet of service, while her mind wandered to the dusty workbench in her father's garage. She could almost smell the metallic tang of lubricating oil and the faint scent of old wood. She remembered the weight of his favorite loop in her hand, the way the world shrank to the intricate landscape of a watch's inner workings. He'd taught her to see beyond the surface, to look for the telltale signs of stress in metal, the subtle discoloration that signaled a flaw in the tempering, the hairline fractures that a layman would mistake for a trick of the light. "The metal always tells the truth, Alara," he used to say, his voice thick with a French-Canadian accent. "You just have to be patient enough to listen." It was time to clear the main course. The lawyers had devoured their meals, but Alistair had barely touched his filet mignon. His focus was entirely on the conversation with Thorne. "The new forging process has been a complete success, Alistair," Thorne was saying, dabbing his mouth with a napkin. "We've cut production time by 15% and material waste by half. The cases are stronger, lighter, and absolutely perfect. Our quality control team signed off on every single unit." "Your quality control team is new, Marcus," Alistair countered. "They were trained on your new processes. My old guard, the men who have been with me for 40 years, they are not so easily convinced. With all due respect, Alistair, your old guard is resistant to change. We have to evolve to survive. Sterling Vanguard understands that. They are impressed with our efficiency." As Alara leaned in to retrieve Alistair's plate, the overhead spotlight caught the Elysian watch at a precise angle. For a fraction of a second, a sliver of intense light raced across the polished bezel. And in that fleeting moment, Alara saw it. It wasn't a scratch. It wasn't a smudge. It was a line. It was an impossibly fine, ghost-like filament. no thicker than a spider's thread, running from the base of the top right lug and disappearing under the edge of the sapphire crystal. To anyone else, it would have been an optical illusion, a reflection from the faceted crystal. But Elara saw it for what it was. The color was infinitesimally different from the surrounding platinum, a duller, slightly grayer hue. The light didn't dance on it, it was absorbed by it. Her breath caught in her chest. Her hand holding the heavy plate froze mid-air. It was a micro-fissure, a stress fracture. A memory, sharp and visceral, struck her like a physical blow. She was 16 in her father's workshop. He was showing her a beautiful, antique pocket watch case he was restoring. He pointed to a nearly identical invisible line. "See this?" he'd whispered. "This is what happens when you rush the annealing process. You heat the metal too fast or cool it too quickly to save time. It looks perfect, polishes up like a mirror. But the internal structure is compromised. It's brittle. One good knock, a change in temperature, and crack." He had tapped the case lightly with a small brass hammer, and a visible fracture had instantly bloomed from the faint line, shattering the beautiful engraving. "It's a catastrophic failure waiting to happen," he had said, his eyes sad. A lie, hidden in the metal. Elara straightened up, the plate feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. It couldn't be. This was the Elysian, a watch with a projected retail price of $50,000. The case material was a new secret alloy developed by Finch & Sons. Their quality control would be legendary. Thorne had just said every unit was perfect. Her, a waitress, second-guessing a team of engineers and metallurgists at a century-old company? It was insane. She looked at the men at the table. They were arguing now about the marketing slogan. They were focused on the image, the brand, the deal. They weren't looking at the thing itself, not with a maker's eye. Their gaze slid right over the beautiful surface, blind to the lie hidden within. Elara backed away from the booth, her mind a chaotic storm. Say nothing. That was the smart choice, the only choice. Interrupting this meeting would be professional suicide. They would laugh at her. She would be fired on the spot, probably blacklisted from every fine dining establishment in the city. The sheer, unmitigated arrogance of it, a girl who serves their coffee, presuming to know more about their product than they did. She turned and walked toward the kitchen, her legs feeling disconnected from her body. But her father's words echoed in her ears, a lie hidden in the metal. She knew what this flaw meant. It wasn't just cosmetic. A watch case protects the delicate, intricate movement inside. Hundreds of tiny, precision-engineered parts working in harmony. A compromised case meant the watch wasn't water-resistant. A change in pressure or a minor impact could shatter it. It meant that every single one of the 10,000 units Thorne had just boasted about was a $50,000 ticking time bomb. The recall would be catastrophic. The financial loss would be staggering. But the damage to the Finch & Sons name, a name built for 130 years on the promise of perfection and durability, would be absolute. It would not just kill the deal with Sterling Vanguard, it would kill the company itself. Alistair Finch's legacy would be a decade of work culminating in a fraud. Her eyes flickered back to Alistair. She saw the deep lines of worry etched around his eyes, the way his hand rested near the watch, almost protectively. He was a craftsman. He deserved to know the truth. This felt like a betrayal aimed directly at him. Thorne's words about the new process and efficiency suddenly sounded sinister. Had he cut corners to impress the equity firm? Had he silenced the old guard, who might have raised objections? Elara stood paralyzed at the service station, clutching a water pitcher, her knuckles white. She could turn away, finish her shift, collect her meager tips, and go home to her worried mother. In 48 hours, Alistair Finch's world would implode, and she would be just another anonymous face in the city, reading about the downfall of a titan. Or she could risk her job, her dignity, and her anonymity on the ghost of a lesson learned in a dusty workshop. She could step into the fire. The decision felt like stepping off the edge of the Willis Tower, into the vast, terrifying emptiness, hoping she had remembered how to fly. For what felt like a lifetime, Elara remained frozen, trapped between the instinct for self-preservation and the undeniable scream of her conscience. She mechanically went through the motions, refilling water glasses at a neighboring table, her hands steady while her insides churned with a nauseating cocktail of fear and resolve. She was a nobody, an anonymous cog in the service industry machine. To these men, she was as much a part of the restaurant's furniture as the chair she occasionally dusted. To speak up was to invite ridicule and ruin, but the image of that hairline fracture was seared onto the back of her eyelids. It wasn't just a flaw in a product, it was a moral flaw. It was the kind of lazy, dishonest craftsmanship her father had despised, the kind of corner cutting that valued profit over integrity. To let it pass felt like a betrayal of his memory, a betrayal of the very principles that had once been the guiding stars of her own life. She glanced again at Alistair Finch. He was holding the Elysian now, turning it over in his hands with a jeweler's reverence. There was a profound sadness in his posture, the look of a man who had built a cathedral but was now being forced to sell off the stones. He was surrounded by his highest-paid advisors, men whose entire purpose was to protect him, and yet in that moment he looked utterly alone, blind to the dagger aimed at the heart of his life's work. Damn it all. With a shuddering intake of breath, she set her shoulders. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She picked up a polished silver coffee pot from the service stand. It was a prop, her excuse, her key to enter their fortified world for the 30 seconds she would need. Her hand trembled, causing the dark liquid within to slosh almost imperceptibly. She began the long walk across the dining room, each step a deliberate battle against the screaming urge to flee. The plush carpet seemed to swallow the sound of her footsteps, making her feel like a ghost approaching the land of the living. As she drew near, Marcus Thorne was in the middle of a triumphant monologue. And the early feedback from the pre-launch placements has been phenomenal, Alistair. Forbes is calling it an American triumph. The Robb report says it's an instant classic. Once Sterling Vanguard's capital injection hits, we can ramp up production to 50,000 units a year. We're not just saving the company, we're building an empire. Finch remained silent, his expression clouded with doubt. Praise from magazines is fleeting, Marcus. The judgment of a generation is not. This was her moment, now or never. Elora stepped into the circle of light around the booth. "Excuse me, Mr. Finch," she said. Her voice, though quiet, sliced through the dense atmosphere of the conversation like a razor. 4 sets of powerful eyes snapped toward her. The expressions ranged from mild surprise on the lawyers' faces to naked annoyance on Marcus Thorne's. Thorne's smile tightened into a dismissive sneer. "We don't need anything right now, thank you." It was a clear, brutal dismissal meant to put her back in her place. Alara's gaze did not waver from Alistair Finch. She held the coffee pot aloft like a shield. "More coffee, sir?" she asked, her voice gaining a fraction more strength. "I'm fine," Finch said, his tone curt, though without Thorne's malice. He started to turn away. "Mr. Finch," she persisted, her voice now firm, cutting through his dismissal. "I'm sorry to be so forward. My name is Alara." Finch paused. He turned back slowly, his wintry eyes focusing on her for the first time, not as a server, but as a person. He saw the tremor in her hand, but he also saw the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. He was a man who had built his life on judging character and quality in an instant. He didn't dismiss her. He waited. "What is it, Alara?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that commanded the silence of the entire table. The air thickened. Her throat felt as if it were filled with sand. The hostile glares from the other men were almost a physical force. "Sir, the watch," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "The Elysian. I used to study metalsmithing. My father was a clockmaker." Thorne let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. "Is that right? Well, I can assure you, young lady, we have the top metallurgists in the country on our payroll. We're quite covered." He waved his hand impatiently. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we're finalizing a multi-billion-dollar transaction." "Marcus," Finch said. The name was spoken quietly, but it was laced with a thread of pure steel. Thorne's mouth snapped shut. Finch's piercing gaze remained fixed on Alara. "You were saying?" The world seemed to shrink to the space between them. The clatter of the restaurant, the murmur of other diners, it all faded into a distant roar. "The case," she said, using her free hand to point, her finger trembling slightly. On the bezel, near the top right lug, there's a line, a fissure. Thorne leaned forward, a look of theatrical disbelief on his face. He picked up the watch and held it under the light, angling it back and forth. A line? I don't see a line. There's nothing here. Perhaps you need your eyes checked. He shot a venomous look at her, an unspoken threat hanging in the air. It's a micro fissure, Alara insisted, her voice gaining conviction as the technical words, so long dormant, came back to her. It's a sign of crystalline fracture from improper annealing. You can only see it at a certain angle. The metal has been heated or cooled too quickly during the forging process. It's brittle. The entire case integrity is compromised. The silence that descended upon the table was absolute and profound. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of astonishment. The lawyers exchanged bewildered glances. Marcus Thorne stared at her as if she'd begun speaking in Aramaic. He finally found his voice, sputtering with indignation. Improper annealing? That is the most ludicrous, unsubstantiated nonsense I have ever heard. Our new forging process is state-of-the-art, patented. This is an insult to my entire team. He turned to Alistair, his face a mask of outrage. Alistair, are you seriously going to entertain this fantasy from a waitress? She's probably looking for a handout, a payday. Let me call security. The insult, sharp and cruel, struck Alara, making her cheeks burn with shame. But she didn't back down. She had said what she needed to say. She met Alistair Finch's gaze directly. It was in his hands now. Finch didn't look at Thorne. He didn't look at the lawyers. His eyes, like a master craftsman examining a raw diamond, were locked on Alara. He saw the cheap, worn shoes. He saw the slight fraying on the cuff of her shirt. But he also saw the unshakable certainty in her eyes. He heard the specific, technical language, not the vague complaint of a customer, but the precise diagnosis of an expert. It was the language his own father had used, and for weeks his own gut, the intuition honed over 50 years of working with metal, had been telling him that something about Thorne's new, efficient process felt too good to be true. He made a decision that would alter the course of everything. He extended his hand not to Alara, but to Thorne. Give me the watch. Thorne hesitated, his expression flashing with panic. Alistair, this is ridiculous. Give it to me, Marcus. The command was absolute. Reluctantly, Thorne placed the watch in Finch's outstretched palm. Finch held it, his thumb gently tracing the bezel. Then he looked up, not at Alara, but at the restaurant's maitre d', who was hovering anxiously nearby. Frank, Finch called out, his voice resonating through the hushed dining room. Bring me a jeweler's loop, a 10X if you have it. The request was so bizarre, so out of place, that the maitre d' simply stared, dumbfounded. A jeweler's loop, Mr. Finch? Now, Frank. As the maitre d' scurried away, a new excruciating tension settled over the table. Thorne was sweating now, a fine sheen of perspiration on his forehead. The coffee pot in Alara's hand felt like it was forged from lead. Alistair Finch then turned his gaze back to her. You, wait here. He gestured to the empty seat at the head of the booth, a space no one but his most trusted confidants ever occupied. Sit. Alara's mind short-circuited. She was being invited to sit at Alistair Finch's table. Marcus Thorne looked as though he might physically combust. Numbly, she placed the coffee pot on a service tray and slid into the soft leather of the booth. Her simple black and white uniform was a stark island of servitude in a sea of bespoke tailoring. The entire restaurant was now watching, sensing that they were witnessing not just a dinner, but a corporate drama playing out in real time. The fuse had been lit. The bomb her father had warned her about was about to go off. The 5 minutes it took for the maitre d' to return with a small black jeweler's loop felt like 5 geological epochs. Alara sat ramrod straight in the plush leather booth, her hands clenched in her lap, trying to ignore the furious, hate-filled glare coming from Marcus Thorne. He was radiating a palpable aura of menace, his carefully constructed world teetering on the brink of collapse because of her. The lawyers sat in stunned silence, their legal pads forgotten. now mere spectators at a trial that had suddenly erupted without a judge or jury. Alistair Finch took the loop from the trembling hand of the maitre d' without a word. He ignored the whispers and stares from the surrounding tables. His world had shrunk to the object in his hand. With the slow, deliberate movement of a surgeon, he positioned the Elysian under the table's spotlight and brought the loop to his right eye. Silence. He tilted the watch, minutely adjusting the angle. His breath held. The only sounds were the distant clatter of cutlery and the frantic thumping of Elara's own heart. Then a small, sharp intake of breath from Finch. He didn't move for a full 10 seconds. He just stared, frozen. When he finally lowered the loop, the color had drained from his face. He looked older, frailer, as if the life force had been sucked out of him. The weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a look of profound, soul-crushing disappointment. He had seen the lie. "Well, Marcus?" Alistair said, his voice deceptively calm, a quiet deadliness that was far more terrifying than shouting. Thorne, seeing the look on Alistair's face, began to bluster, his voice a pitch higher than usual. "Alistair, it's a shadow, a polishing compound residue. It's nothing. Our instruments would have detected any structural flaw. It's impossible." "Impossible?" Alistair repeated the word, letting it hang in the air. He slid the watch and the loop across the table to the senior lawyer. "You take a look, Jonathan. Tell me what you see." The lawyer, a man accustomed to the abstract world of contracts, fumbled with the loop. He squinted through it, his face inches from the watch. After a moment he looked up, his expression grim. I see it, Alistair. It's a line. Very fine, but it's there." Thorne's facade of outrage finally cracked, revealing the raw panic beneath. "He doesn't know what he's looking at. This is a conspiracy. She must have been sent here by a competitor to sabotage the launch." He pointed a trembling finger at Elara. "Who are you working for?" Before Elara could even process the wild accusation, Alistair Finch slammed his open palm down on the mahogany table. The crack echoed through the restaurant like a gunshot, silencing every conversation. "Enough!" he roared, his voice filled with the fury of a betrayed king. The force of it made everyone at the table flinch. He turned his glacial eyes on Thorne, and the executive visibly shrank back into his seat. "You talk of conspiracies, Marcus?" Alistair's voice dropped to a low, venomous snarl. "Let's talk about your new, efficient forging process. The one you rushed into production against the advice of men who have forgotten more about metallurgy than you will ever know. Let's talk about how you cut the annealing cycle time by a third to meet an arbitrary deadline set by a pack of corporate vultures." He knew, Elara realized with a jolt. He had suspected it all along. He just didn't have the proof. He hadn't been able to see it, until now. "This isn't a flaw, Marcus," Alistair continued, his voice raw with pain. "It's a signature. It's the signature of your greed and your impatience. You have taken my family's name, my father's legacy, and you have poisoned it from the inside out." He leaned back, the fire in his eyes banking into cold, hard embers. He looked at his lawyers. "The deal with Sterling Vanguard is dead. Inform them immediately. The launch is canceled. Issue a stop work order on the entire production line, effective now. And Jonathan," he added, his gaze flicking to Thorne, "I want you to prepare a lawsuit against Mr. Thorne for gross negligence and corporate fraud. He is to be escorted from the premises of Finch & Sons first thing in the morning. He is not to touch his computer. He is not to speak to anyone. Is that clear?" The lawyer simply nodded, his face pale. Marcus Thorne sat as if turned to stone. His face, the silence that descended in the wake of Alistair Finch's departure, was a physical entity, a vacuum that sucked the air from Elara's lungs. It was heavier than the stares of the other patrons, more deafening than the frantic, whispered conversations that immediately erupted around them. Marcus Thorne remained slumped in the booth, a man carved from wax whose inner flame had been extinguished. His face, once a mask of predatory confidence, was now a slack, gray portrait of ruin. The muscles in his jaw worked silently, chewing on the ashes of a 30-year career. He did not look at Elara. To acknowledge her would be to acknowledge the fulcrum on which his entire world had just violently pivoted and shattered. He was a ghost at his own wake, Ilara felt a dizzying sense of dislocation, as if she were watching a film of someone else's life. The expensive leather of the booth felt cold and alien against her skin. On the table, stark against the dark wood, lay the $100 bill and the impossibly heavy business card, a severance package for one life, a summons to another. The maitre d', Frank, approached the table with the trepidation of a man entering a blast crater. He cleared a single, untouched water glass, his movements clumsy, his eyes refusing to meet either Ilara's or Thorne's. The entire restaurant staff moved around booth 14 with a new superstitious reverence, as if it were now a cursed space. Slowly, her limbs feeling as though they were moving through deep water, Ilara slid out of the booth. She took the business card, its crisp edges a sharp, definitive reality in her trembling hand. She left the $100 bill. To take it would feel wrong, like accepting payment for a eulogy. This was never about money. It was about a lie hidden in metal. As she walked toward the employee changing room, the ambient noise of the restaurant returned, but it sounded different now. Distant and muffled, the soundtrack to a world she no longer fully inhabited. Her coworkers averted their gazes, a mixture of awe, fear, and pity in their expressions. She had broken the cardinal rule of service. She had become visible. She had not only spoken to the gods, she had passed judgment upon them, and one had been struck from the sky. In their eyes, she was no longer one of them. She was something other, something dangerous. The journey home was a surreal dreamscape. The biting November wind off Lake Michigan felt real, slicing through her thin coat, but nothing else did. The rhythmic clatter of the Brown Line L train was a familiar metronome counting out the beats of a life that felt a universe away. She stared at her own reflection in the darkened window, a pale, wide-eyed ghost superimposed over the glittering, indifferent lights of the city. Who was that girl? Just 12 hours ago, her world had been defined by the ache in her feet, the price of her mother's medication, and the suffocating weight of a deferred dream. Now the dream had punched a hole through reality and dragged her through it. She felt no triumph. The adrenaline had long since leached away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a hollow, ringing fear. She had destroyed a man tonight. Whatever his sins, Marcus Thorne had a life, a family perhaps, a history that she had irrevocably incinerated with a few whispered words. And for what? For the integrity of an object she could never afford, for the honor of a man she did not know. Was it courage, or was it a catastrophic, arrogant folly? Her father's voice echoed in her memory, not with praise, but with his constant, gentle warnings about the weight of knowledge. To see the flaw is to own the responsibility for it, Ilara. You cannot unsee it. When she finally let herself into the small, quiet apartment in Logan Square, her mother was waiting up, a book lying open in her lap, her face etched with the familiar lines of worry. "Lara, you're so late. Is everything all right?" Ilara looked at her mother, the woman for whom she had sacrificed everything, and the dam of her composure broke. She didn't tell her the story. The words were too large, too unbelievable to fit in their small, quiet living room. Instead, she just sank to her knees, laid her head in her mother's lap as she had when she was a child, and wept. She wept for her father, for the lost years, for the terrifying, unknown chasm that had just opened before her, and her mother, asking no questions, simply stroked her hair, a silent, anchoring presence against the storm. The next morning, the city was shrouded in a cold, gray mist that seemed to muffle the world. Standing before the monolithic brick facade of the Finch & Sons factory, Ilara felt a tremor of pure, unadulterated imposter syndrome. The building was not a factory, it was a temple. It exuded a gravitas that made her simple, clean clothes feel like a cheap costume. This was the world she had dreamed of, and now, standing at its gates, she felt like a blasphemer. The lobby was a hushed sanctuary of horological devotion. The air itself seemed different, tinged with the faint, clean sense of lubricating oil, polished brass, and old, dignified wood. It smelled like her father's workshop, a scent so deeply embedded in her memory that it brought a fresh wave of grief and longing. On the fourth floor, the world transformed. It was a stunning synthesis of old and new. Sunlight streamed through vast, archaic windows, illuminating a space where master craftsmen, hunched in pools of lamplight like medieval monks, worked alongside gleaming, state-of-the-art diagnostic machines. The quiet hum of machinery was punctuated by the delicate, almost imperceptible clicks and whirs of time being assembled by human hands. Alistair Finch stood waiting, not beside a desk, but beside a scanning electron microscope that dominated one corner of the room. He wore the same clothes as the night before, his shirt rumpled, his face a roadmap of sleeplessness. The titan of industry was gone. In his place stood a weary artisan who had spent the night wrestling with the soul of his creation. Beside him was a man who seemed as much a part of the building as the old brick walls. His face was a landscape of deep-set lines, his hands gnarled by a lifetime of manipulating miniature tools, yet they possessed a preternatural stillness. This was Henrik Sorensen, the company's living memory. Miss Rousseau, Alistair's voice was gravelly, stripped of all pretense. Thank you for coming, he gestured to the older man. This is Henrik Sorensen, our master horologist. Henrik did not offer his hand. Instead, he gave her a long, appraising look, his pale blue eyes magnified slightly by his spectacles. It was not a look of skepticism, but of intense, professional scrutiny, as if he were examining the grain of a rare piece of wood or the fasting on a diamond. The eye does not lie, Henrik said, his voice a soft Danish murmur that was nearly lost in the hum of the room. We have been looking since midnight. You were correct. Alistair gestured toward the microscope's viewing screen. A massively magnified image of the Elysian's platinum alloy filled the display. It looked like a satellite photograph of a frozen alien landscape, and running across it, stark and undeniable, was a dark, jagged canyon, the microfissure. It's a propagation of intergranular cracks, Alistair said, his voice heavy with the weight of the diagnosis. Thorne's rapid induction heating didn't give the alloy's crystalline structure time to normalize during the annealing phase. It created immense internal stress. The surface is polished to perfection, but underneath, it is poison. He pointed to the screen. Every single case we've examined is riddled with them. 10,000 timepieces waiting to fail. He turned from the screen, his gaze meeting Alara's. The raw pain in his eyes was startling. 30 years Marcus was with me. He started in the mailroom. I taught him what my father taught me, or I tried to, but he never learned to listen. He only learned to count. He ran a hand over his face. He saw my legacy as a product to be leveraged, a brand to be monetized. He never understood that it is a promise made in steel and gold and sapphire, that what we make is true. Alistair fell silent, the confession hanging in the air between them. He had not just been betrayed by an employee. He had been betrayed by a man he had considered, in some ways, a son. Alara's discovery had not just averted a business disaster, it had exposed a deep personal rot at the heart of his life. I am sorry, Alara said quietly, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. Do not be, Alistair countered, a flicker of steel returning to his voice. Sorrow is a useless indulgence. Action is required. He led her away from the harsh light of the diagnostic corner and toward his office, a space that was more a library than a corporate suite. Books on metallurgy, physics, and art history lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The only photograph was a black and white image of a younger Alistair and his father, their heads bent together over a watchmaker's bench, their shared focus an almost tangible thing. He did not sit behind his large oak desk. Instead, he remained standing, pacing before the large window that overlooked the main workshop floor. I have spent the last 6 hours dismantling a 10-year project in a $2 billion deal, he said, his voice flat and methodical. The launch is canceled. The production run will be melted down. Every last case, every component. We will absorb the loss. It will be staggering. It will set us back years. But we will not ship a lie. We will start again. He stopped pacing and turned to her, his focus absolute. Last night, you spoke a truth that my entire executive team, with their advanced degrees and six-figure salaries, was either unable or unwilling to see. You spoke it at great personal risk for no personal gain. That is a quality I find myself in desperately short supply of. He walked to his desk and picked up a simple, elegant watch with a worn leather strap. It was not one of the company's modern creations. It was older, simpler. This was my father's watch. He made it himself. It has kept near perfect time for 60 years, not because of its complexity, but because of its integrity. Every gear, every spring, every screw was made with intention. He used to say that a watch is a system of trust. The owner trusts that it will be true to the time. The watchmaker trusts that every component will be true to its function. A single flawed part, a single lie, breaks the entire system. He placed the watch back on the desk with a quiet reverence. Marcus Thorne was a flawed component. He nearly broke the system. I have spent my life safeguarding this company from outside threats, from quartz movements, from smartwatches, from shifting markets. I never thought the greatest threat would come from within. He looked directly at Alara, and she felt the full weight of his 72 years of experience, of his burdens and his hopes, settle upon her. I have read your academic records from RISD. I have spoken to your former professors. They used the words prodigy and instinctive. One of them told me you had old hands. I believe I know what he meant. He took a deep breath. I am not going to offer you a reward, Miss Rousseau. A reward is a closing statement, an end to a transaction. I am not interested in ending this conversation. I am interested in beginning one that will last for the next 50 years. The air in the room grew still. I am canceling your student debt and your family's medical debt. Consider that a point of order, a clearing of the ledger so that we may begin on a level field. It is not a gift. It is an investment in an asset I believe to be critical to this company's future. Then I am establishing a research grant in your name. It will fund the completion of your degree with a stipend that will ensure you want for nothing. You will have access to our facilities, our archives, our people. You will finish what you started, not just for yourself, but for us. Ilara's mind struggled to process the scale of what he was saying. It was a lifeline, a miracle, a fantasy made real. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she held them back. But that is only the beginning, he continued, his voice growing more intense. When you graduate, there will not be a job waiting for you. A job is a set of tasks. I am offering you a purpose. Henrik is 78 years old. I am 72. We are the last of the old guard. We need new eyes. We need a conscience. We need someone who can listen to the metal. I am offering you an apprenticeship directly under me and under Henrik. You will learn every facet of this company, not to run it, but to protect it. Your sole responsibility will be to the integrity of the work. You will have the authority to halt any production line, to question any process, to be the dissenting voice that I have so foolishly allowed to be silenced. You will be the guardian of our promise. He stood before her, not as a CEO offering a position, but as a king offering a sacred charge. The immensity of it was terrifying, a weight far heavier than any debt. He was offering to return her dream, but he was also asking her to carry the burden of his legacy. The tears she had been holding back finally traced a path down her cheeks. The word yes felt too small. She could only nod, a profound, shuddering affirmation that came from the deepest part of her soul. A flicker of a smile, the first she had seen, touched Alistair Finch's lips. It was a small, weary thing, but it was genuine. Good, he said softly. Then our work begins now. He did not lead her to a design studio or a boardroom. Instead, he and Henrik led her away from the main workshop, down a quiet, dusty corridor to a door with a simple brass plaque that read, Archives. The room inside was not an office. It was a watchmaker's ghost. In the center of the room, draped in a canvas cloth, was a single heavy wooden workbench, scarred and stained with the oils and chemicals of a lifetime of work. Finch gently pulled back the cloth. Laid out on the worn wood was a complete set of staking tools, their steel heads gleaming softly in the dim light. Beside them was a familiar battered brass loop and a set of tweezers worn smooth from use. The wooden handles of the tools were dark with age, polished to a deep patina by the grip of a hand she knew better than her own. It was her father's workbench. After he passed, Alistair said, his voice gentle. We heard his workshop tools were being sold at an estate auction. Henrik went himself. He said it was a crime for a master's tools to be scattered to the winds. They belong with people who understand what they are. Alara reached out a trembling hand and touched the handle of a small burnisher, its wood grain as familiar to her as a fingerprint. A sob, sharp and painful, escaped her. It was a sound of grief and gratitude so profound it was almost unbearable. These were not just tools. They were an extension of the man who had taught her everything, the silent witnesses to her childhood, the keepers of her first and most cherished dream. Finch had not just offered her a future, he had, in this single incredible gesture, restored a piece of her past. He had given her back a part of her father. She picked up the brass loop. The metal was cool against her palm. She raised it to her eye, not looking at anything in particular. The muscle memory of the act as natural as breathing. The world shrank to a small, focused circle of light. The dust motes dancing in the air became brilliant stars. For the first time in 2 years, the world felt clear. The dull, persistent ache in her feet, the phantom limb of her waitress's life, was gone. The soul of the maker is in the thing that is made, she whispered, repeating the words her father had spoken to her 100 times at this very bench. Henrik Sorensen placed a gentle, gnarled hand on her shoulder. And now, he said, his voice full of a quiet, profound welcome, the maker has come home.